In the late 1930s, as war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, the United States Army Air Corps faced a problem that seemed unsolvable. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of climbing faster and flying higher than any potential enemy aircraft. The specifications were ambitious. The aircraft needed to reach 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, climb to that altitude in 6 minutes, and maintain effectiveness in combat. Single-engine designs simply could not generate enough power to meet these requirements. The obvious solution was twin engines. 2 power plants provided double the horsepower, enabling the speed and climb rate the Army demanded. Twin engines also offered crucial safety advantages. If one engine failed, the pilot could fly home on the remaining engine rather than attempting a forced landing in enemy territory. For Army planners, twin engines made perfect sense on paper, but every attempt to build a twin-engine fighter ran into the same fundamental problem: torque. When a propeller spins, it generates rotational force. If both engines spun their propellers in the same direction, the combined torque created a powerful rolling force. The aircraft wanted to rotate violently along its longitudinal axis. Pilots described fighting the controls constantly, the airplane trying to flip over, requiring exhausting physical effort to maintain level flight. Test pilots reported these early twin-engine fighter prototypes were dangerous, perhaps lethally so. Several crashes occurred as aircraft rolled out of control, despite pilot efforts. Engineers tried various solutions: larger tail surfaces, modified wing designs, complex mechanical systems. Each solution added weight and complexity. Most importantly, none worked satisfactorily. By 1937, growing consensus emerged among military aviation experts that twin-engine fighters might be fundamentally flawed. Perhaps the physics simply did not allow for a practical combat aircraft with 2 engines. The Army would have to accept reduced performance rather than pursue an aircraft type that could not be made safe. The dream of a high-altitude interceptor seemed to be dying. Then Lockheed Aircraft Corporation submitted a proposal for what would become the P-38 Lightning. The design was radical: twin booms extending from the engines, cockpit and armament in a central nacelle, liquid-cooled Allison engines. On paper, it met every Army requirement, but it still had the torque problem that had doomed every other twin-engine fighter concept. What nobody fully appreciated yet was that Lockheed had a young civilian engineer named Clarence Johnson, called Kelly by everyone, who had not yet learned that some problems were supposed to be impossible to solve. Kelly Johnson was 27 years old in 1937 when Lockheed began work on what would become the XP-38 prototype. He had joined Lockheed in 1933, fresh from the University of Michigan with a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. His background was academic and theoretical rather than practical and military. He had never served in uniform, never flown in combat, never been immersed in military aviation culture with its established doctrines and accepted limitations. This inexperience was actually Johnson's greatest asset. He had not absorbed the industry's accumulated assumptions about what worked and what did not. He approached problems with fresh eyes and willingness to question everything. The torque problem became apparent immediately during design. Engineers ran calculations predicting how the aircraft would behave, with both engines spinning propellers clockwise. The numbers were discouraging. The rolling moment would be substantial, requiring significant control deflection that would create drag and reduce speed. At high angles of attack during combat maneuvering, controls might lack authority to overcome torque, resulting in loss of control. Senior engineers proposed conventional solutions in large stabilizers, design complex automatic control systems, install mechanical differentials for varying power between engines. Each proposal was analyzed and calculated. Each added weight or complexity. None provided truly satisfactory solutions. Johnson attended these meetings and studied the proposals. He understood the approaches, but kept returning to a fundamental question nobody else seemed to ask. Why did both propellers need to spin in the same direction? The convention was so established, it seemed like natural law. Propellers spun clockwise because that was how propellers had always spun. Yet Johnson could find no physical principle requiring propellers to rotate the same direction. The convention existed for manufacturing convenience. Factories produced one type of propeller, one configuration of gears. Making everything spin the same way simplified production and maintenance. But convenience was not necessity. He began working through mathematics of what would happen if propellers spun opposite directions. Left engine clockwise, right engine counterclockwise. The torque from the left would try rolling the aircraft right. Torque from the right would try rolling left. If engines produced equal power and were mounted symmetrically, the torque forces would cancel. Net rolling moment would be zero. The concept was almost embarrassingly simple. Johnson knew this would sound naive to experienced engineers. Simple solutions to complex problems were usually wrong. If counter-rotating propellers were the answer, surely someone would have thought of it already. But he could not find the flaw. The physics worked. The mathematics was straightforward. Manufacturing would be more complicated, but manufacturing challenges could be solved. These were practical obstacles, not physical impossibilities. He decided to present the idea. The meeting took place at Lockheed's Burbank facility in early 1938 Hall. Hibbard chaired the session with senior engineers gathered around a table, covered with drawings and calculations. The torque problem was once again on the agenda. Previous meetings had failed to produce satisfactory solutions, and the Army was growing impatient. Johnson waited through presentations of conventional solutions before asking to present an alternative. Instead of both propellers rotating the same direction, what if they rotated opposite directions? Left engine clockwise, right counterclockwise, the torque forces would cancel. The rolling moment would be eliminated. The silence that followed was not impressed contemplation, but experienced engineers trying to determine if their young colleague was serious. Counter-rotating propellers seemed simplistic. Surely there had to be a reason this had never been done. If it were this easy, someone would have solved the torque problem years ago. Questions came quickly, skeptically. Counter-rotating propellers meant completely different designs for left and right sides. Manufacturing would need mirror image components. Inventory systems would track left-hand and right-hand parts. Maintenance crews would need different procedures for each engine. Supply chains would be vastly complicated. What about asymmetric thrust during single-engine operation? Johnson had anticipated these questions. Yes, manufacturing would be more complex but manageable. Yes, maintenance required more training, but training could be developed. Yes, supply chains would be complicated, but planning could address that. Single-engine operation would actually be easier because there would be no residual rolling moment to fight. He showed his calculations. Torque from one Allison engine generated specific rolling moment. Torque from the second engine spinning opposite generated equal and opposite moment. The sum was zero. Controls would not need deflection to counteract torque. Drag penalty would disappear. The aircraft would fly more efficiently. Senior engineers examined Johnson's work looking for errors. They found none. The calculations were correct. The physics was sound. Yet the simplicity remained troubling. Aviation engineering was supposed to be difficult, requiring sophisticated approaches. Making propellers spin backward seemed too easy. Hall Hibbard recognized that skepticism based on simplicity was not scientific. He asked Johnson to prepare detailed proposals showing implementation on the P-38. If Johnson could answer questions satisfactorily, Hibbard would present the concept to the Army. Johnson worked obsessively on detailed design over following weeks. Engines remained largely unchanged. The Allison V1710 could reverse rotation by flipping the reduction gear assembly. This was not trivial, but was within existing capabilities. Lockheed would manufacture two types of gears, but the gears were not dramatically different. Propellers required more significant changes. A clockwise propeller could not simply reverse to counterclockwise. Blade angle, twist, and pitch needed redesign for opposite rotation. This meant developing mirror image propellers. Propeller manufacturers understood how to design for specific rotation directions. They had simply never been asked for left-hand and right-hand versions of the same aircraft. Johnson compiled findings into comprehensive proposals. Weight penalty was minimal, perhaps 50 pounds. Performance benefit was substantial, eliminating torque-induced drag. Development risk was manageable because no fundamentally new technology was required. Hibbard reviewed, made suggestions, and submitted to Army technical staff. Military engineers were as skeptical as Lockheed engineers initially. But the Army had invested significantly in the P-38 and was running out of alternatives. They authorized Lockheed to proceed with a prototype incorporating counter-rotating propellers. Nobody was entirely confident it would work. Calculations were one thing. A real aircraft at 400 miles per hour was quite another. The proof would come when a test pilot took the modified XP-38 into the sky, January 27, 1939. Lockheed's test facility at March Field, California. The modified XP-38 sat on the ramp, both engines running. Their sound different from any other aircraft because propellers spun opposite directions. Left clockwise, right counterclockwise. The asymmetric rotation visible even from the ground. Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey, the Army test pilot assigned to evaluate the XP-38, climbed into the cockpit. Kelsey was experienced, having flown numerous experimental aircraft. He understood the stakes. If counter-rotating propellers failed, the entire P-38 program was likely finished. If they worked, the P-38 would become a cornerstone of American air power. Kelsey advanced throttles. Engines responded smoothly. The first test was simple, taxi operations. With both engines at equal power, did the aircraft track straight or pull to one side? Conventional twin-engine aircraft always wanted to veer due to asymmetric propeller effects. The XP-38 tracked straight with minimal correction. Kelsey could feel the difference immediately. His feet on rudder pedals were not fighting constant pressure. The aircraft wanted to go where pointed. Encouraging, but the real test would come airborne. Kelsey lined up, completed checks, and released brakes. The XP-38 accelerated rapidly. The acceleration was impressive, but more impressive was what was not happening. No rolling tendency, no need for aileron correction, no fight against forces trying to flip the aircraft. The XP-38 lifted off and climbed smoothly. Kelsey retracted gear and continued climbing. He began handling tests, turns, pitch changes, speed variations. Throughout all maneuvers, the aircraft remained stable and responsive. Controls felt balanced. No mysterious forces required constant correction. Then Kelsey tested the most problematic scenario, high power at low speed, simulating combat conditions. This was where torque effects were strongest and most dangerous. He reduced to near stall speed, then advanced throttles to maximum. In conventional designs, this could produce uncontrollable rolling. The XP-38 responded with acceleration, but no rolling. Propellers, spinning opposite directions, cancelled torque so completely that the aircraft remained stable, even under most challenging conditions. Kelsey held the configuration for several minutes, maneuvering aggressively. The aircraft continued responding predictably. He radioed preliminary assessment. The counter-rotating propellers worked. The torque problem was solved. The difference was night and day. Where previous prototypes required constant physical effort, the XP-38 flew like a stable aircraft that did what the pilot asked without fighting back. Kelsey continued testing throughout the 40-minute flight. He climbed to altitude and measured climb rate. He accelerated to maximum speed and assessed handling. He performed aerobatics to test structure and control authority. In every regime, the P-38 performed at or beyond specifications. When Kelsey landed, engineers and Army observers found him grinning. The XP-38 was everything hoped for and more. Kelly Johnson's simple solution had transformed an uncontrollable prototype into a fighter that handled better than most single-engine aircraft. The crazy fix had worked. Following weeks brought more test flights confirming initial assessment. The P-38 was fast, climbing quickly and reaching speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. It was stable across its entire envelope. It was controllable, even during single-engine operation. The Army placed production orders. Lockheed began preparing to manufacture in quantity. Kelly Johnson, at 28, had solved a problem the entire aviation industry considered potentially unsolvable. His willingness to ask a simple question had created one of World War II's most successful aircraft. But as production began, new challenges emerged, testing whether elegant simplicity could survive wartime manufacturing chaos. Counter-rotating propellers worked beautifully in flight. Production and maintenance implications revealed why conventional wisdom had favored standardization. What seemed simple in concept became complex when multiplied across thousands of aircraft. Lockheed's Burbank facility began manufacturing P-38s in 1941, aiming for hundreds per month by 1942. Every aircraft required two complete propeller systems that were not identical. Left engine needed clockwise rotating propeller with associated reduction gear and hardware. Right engine needed counterclockwise propeller with mirror image components. This doubling cascaded through the supply chain. Hamilton Standard, supplying most American military propellers, needed separate production lines for left-hand and right-hand P-38 propellers. Each line required its own tooling, quality control, and inventory management. Propellers could not be interchanged. Installing left-hand on right engine would result in blades oriented backward, producing zero or negative thrust. Allison faced similar challenges. While basic V-1710 engines were identical, reduction gears connecting engine to propeller were different. Left side used standard gears. Right side needed specially manufactured gears reversing rotation. These precision components required careful machining. Manufacturing capacity for reduction gears became a bottleneck. Supply chains grew exponentially complicated. Every P-38 base needed to stock both left and right propellers, standard and reversed reduction gears, and various handed engine accessories. Inventory systems tracked twice as many unique components. Supply officers ensured shipments included balanced quantities. A base receiving 10 left-hand propellers, but no right-hand, had 0 usable propellers, despite having 10 in inventory. Maintenance training became more complex. Mechanics learned that left-engine procedures differed from right-engine procedures. Installing propellers required checking not only correct model, but correct hand for the aircraft side. Reduction gear service required different tools and procedures depending on left or right engine. Not impossibly difficult, but requiring attention and training, conventional aircraft did not demand. Potential for errors multiplied. A tired mechanic might grab wrong propeller. A supply clerk might ship left-hand gears to a base needing right-hand units. These errors grounded aircraft until correct parts arrived. In combat zones with tenuous supply lines, shortage of right-hand propellers could ground half a squadron, even if left-hand propellers were abundant. Critics seized on these complications as validation of original skepticism. Simpler design using conventional propellers would be easier to manufacture, supply, and maintain. Performance advantages were real, but were they worth logistical headaches? Johnson and Lockheed Engineering fought against proposals to modify P-38s for conventional propellers. They argued logistical challenges were solvable with proper planning. Problems stemmed from inadequate preparation, not fundamental design. Once factories and supply chains adapted, complications would become routine. They also pointed out that compromising performance by returning to conventional propellers would eliminate competitive advantages. The whole point was achieving performance single-engine fighters could not match. Reintroducing torque would negate those advantages. The debate was resolved by combat results. As P-38s reached operational squadrons in 1942, pilots reported overwhelmingly positive experiences. The aircraft performed exactly as promised. Counter-rotating propellers provided flight characteristic advantages pilots could feel and exploit. Manufacturing and supply organizations adapted. Hamilton Standard refined production processes. Allison increased reduction gear output. Supply chains implemented better inventory management. Maintenance crews became experienced with unique requirements. By mid-1943, P-38 production flowed smoothly. Lockheed manufactured over 300 aircraft monthly. Logistical complications had become manageable routine. The production nightmare was over. Counter-rotating propellers were no longer experimental, but proven design features manufacturable at scale. The P-38 was reaching combat theaters in increasing numbers, and pilots were about to demonstrate what Johnson's innovation made possible. December 1942, Southwest Pacific Theater. Japanese forces still held much of New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and numerous territories. Allied forces fought back, but vast distances and harsh conditions made every operation challenging. Air power was critical, but existing fighters struggled with Pacific range requirements. The P-38 Lightning began arriving at forward bases in Australia and New Guinea. Pilots transitioning from P-40 Warhawks immediately noticed differences. The P-38 was larger, heavier, more complex. It had tricycle landing gear, 2 engines, and unusual counter-rotating propellers. Initial reactions were mixed. Some loved the P-38 immediately. Others were skeptical, viewing it as too complex and preferring familiar simplicity. But as pilots accumulated flight time and entered combat, advantages became undeniable. Range was the first obvious benefit. A P-40 had perhaps 200-mile combat radius. The P-38 could fly escort missions 400 miles from base, return with fuel reserves, and still have energy for combat. This range advantage was transformative, where distances were measured in hundreds or thousands of miles of open ocean. Twin-engine configuration provided security single-engine pilots envied. Over water far from friendly territory, engine failure in single-engine fighters meant ditching and hoping for rescue. Engine failure in P-38s meant flying home on one engine. The aircraft maintained altitude and reasonable speed on one Allison. Pilots who experienced engine failures universally praised redundancy that saved lives. Counter-rotating propellers contributed to effectiveness in obvious and subtle ways. Most obvious was stability during gunnery. Fighters needed smooth, predictable response to track targets while firing. The P-38's lack of torque effects meant gun sights stayed on target without constant correction. Pilots reported gunnery accuracy exceeded other fighters. Concentrated nose armament also benefited from counter-rotating design. The P-38 mounted 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon in the nose, all firing forward without shooting through propellers. This concentration, combined with stable gun platform from eliminating torque, made the P-38 devastatingly effective. Hits meant multiple bullets striking nearly the same spot, inflicting damage wing-mounted guns could not achieve. Japanese pilots quickly learned to respect and fear the P-38. They called it the fork-tailed devil, acknowledging both its distinctive silhouette and combat effectiveness. Japanese intelligence identified the P-38 as one of the most dangerous American fighters, advising pilots to avoid engagement if possible. Combat tactics exploited P-38 advantages. Speed allowed choosing when to engage and when to disengage. Pilots could dive on formations, make devastating firing passes, and accelerate away before Japanese fighters responded. Japanese could not catch P-38s wanting to leave. This hit-and-run capability proved highly effective. By mid-1943, P-38 squadrons consistently achieved favorable kill ratios against Japanese aircraft. The Lightning was proving itself as one of the war's premier fighters, particularly suited to Pacific conditions. At the heart of its success was Kelly Johnson's simple innovation, counter-rotating propellers that eliminated torque and created a stable, controllable, devastatingly effective combat aircraft. Richard Bong grew up in rural Wisconsin, a farm boy who learned to hunt and shoot on family property. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, completed training, and arrived in the Southwest Pacific in late 1942. He was assigned to fly P-38 Lightnings with the 49th Fighter Group. Within 2 years, Bong would become America's top ace with 40 confirmed victories. Everyone achieved in the P-38. Bong's success was not accidental. He was a natural pilot with exceptional eyesight, quick reflexes, and aggressive but calculated tactics. But he also benefited from flying aircraft whose design allowed fully utilizing his talents. The P-38's stability from counter-rotating propellers meant when Bong lined up shots, gun sights stayed where he put them. No torque-induced drift required constant correction. His marksmanship translated directly to aerial gunnery because the gun platform remained steady. Thomas McGuire, another P-38 pilot, became America's second highest-scoring ace with 38 victories. McGuire was aggressive, skilled, and tactically sophisticated. Unlike Bong, McGuire was more willing to engage in turning fights, using P-38 power and energy retention during maneuvering combat. Counter-rotating propellers contributed by providing predictable handling during aggressive maneuvering that would have created control challenges in conventional designs. Charles McDonald, who flew P-38s and eventually commanded the 475th Fighter Group, achieved 27 victories. McDonald was known for analytical approaches to combat, carefully studying Japanese tactics and developing countermeasures. He recognized P-38 characteristics, including counter-rotating propeller benefits, gave American pilots specific advantages exploitable through proper tactics. These 3 pilots and dozens of other P-38 aces demonstrated that Johnson's torque solution had real combat consequences. Counter-rotating propellers were not just interesting engineering features. They were tactical advantages skilled pilots could exploit to achieve air superiority. Statistical evidence supported anecdotal reports. P-38 squadrons consistently achieved favorable kill ratios against Japanese aircraft, often exceeding 5.1 or even 10.1 in major engagements. Some success came from superior training and tactics. Some came from P-38 speed and armament advantages. But stable gun platforms created by counter-rotating propellers were foundational elements, making everything else possible. By late 1944, the P-38 had shot down more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter in the Pacific. The fork-tailed devil symbolized American air dominance. Japanese pilots avoided engagement when possible. Recognizing P-38s flown by skilled pilots were extremely dangerous opponents. The aircraft military experts once dismissed as impractical was now the dominant fighter in the world's largest ocean. While fighter pilots achieved ace status, specialized P-38 variants performed equally crucial but less publicized missions. Photo reconnaissance versions, designated F-4 and F-5, used the basic airframe but replaced nose guns with cameras. These unarmed aircraft flew alone deep into enemy territory, relying entirely on speed and altitude to survive while photographing targets. Photo reconnaissance requirements were demanding differently than fighter operations. Aircraft needed flying straight and level over targets for extended periods, while cameras exposed film. Any vibration or movement blurred photographs, rendering them useless. Aircraft needed maintaining precise altitude and heading despite wind, turbulence, and psychological pressure, knowing enemy fighters were likely nearby. Counter-rotating propellers proved almost miraculously suited for these requirements. Elimination of torque effects meant F-4 and F-5 flew rock-steady during camera runs. No rolling tendency to fight, no constant corrections introducing vibration. Aircraft simply flew where pointed stable and smooth, creating ideal platforms for high-altitude photography. Pilots who flew photo reconnaissance P-38s reported aircraft handling made dangerous missions barely possible. Flying alone over enemy territory without weapons was terrifying. Doing so while maintaining perfect straight and level flight for minutes. Knowing any deviation ruined photographs and wasted missions required absolute aircraft trust. P-38 stability provided that trust. Cameras benefited from vibration-free platforms. High-resolution photography from 25,000 feet required extremely precise optics and minimal camera movement. Even slight vibrations from engines or control deflections could blur images. P-38 counter-rotating propellers created uniquely smooth flight environments. Torque forces that would require constant aileron corrections simply did not exist. Eliminating major vibration sources, photo reconnaissance P-38s photographed virtually every significant target in both theaters. They mapped invasion beaches before D-Day. They photographed Japanese-held islands before amphibious assaults. They tracked enemy ship movements, photographed industrial facilities, and monitored bombing damage. Success rates were remarkably high. While fighters and bombers often suffered heavy losses, unarmed P-38s frequently returned from deep penetration missions without damage. Speed, altitude capability, and stable flight characteristics allowed photographing targets and escaping before interception. After the war, photo reconnaissance experts analyzed which aircraft had been most effective for intelligence gathering. F-4 and F-5 P-38 variants ranked at the top. They had photographed more targets, penetrated deeper, and achieved higher survival rates than most other reconnaissance aircraft. Stable platforms created by counter-rotating propellers enabled photographic intelligence, shaping strategic decisions throughout the war. When World War II ended in August 1945, the P-38's combat record was extraordinary. In the Pacific, P-38s destroyed over 1,800 Japanese aircraft. America's top two aces achieved victories exclusively in P-38s. In Europe, P-38s flew thousands of long-range escort and ground attack missions. Photo reconnaissance variants photographed virtually every significant target in both theaters. Total P-38 production exceeded 10,000 aircraft, making it one of the most produced American twin-engine fighters ever built. The design military experts once dismissed as impractical had become a cornerstone of American air power. At the heart of this success was simple innovation proposed by a young civilian engineer who asked a question everyone else overlooked. What if propellers spun opposite directions? The post-war aviation industry absorbed P-38 lessons. Counter-rotating propellers proved themselves under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Future twin-engine designs frequently incorporated counter-rotating propellers as standard practice rather than experimental features. Innovation that seemed radical in 1938 became conventional wisdom by 1950. Kelly Johnson's career trajectory demonstrated his willingness to question assumptions was not one-time insight, but fundamental approach to engineering. He led Lockheed's famous Skunk Works division, designing revolutionary aircraft, including the U-2 spy plane and SR-71 Blackbird. These aircraft pushed boundaries differently than the P-38, but shared common threads. They challenged conventional thinking about what was possible. The SR-71 Blackbird, capable of Mach 3 at 85,000 feet, embodied Johnson's design philosophy. Experts said such performance was impossible. Johnson questioned those assumptions, developed innovative solutions, and proved experts wrong. The same pattern that played out with P-38 counter-rotating propellers repeated with SR-71 titanium airframes and U-2 high aspect ratio wings. The broader lesson extends beyond aviation or engineering. Breakthrough innovations often come from questioning assumptions everyone else accepts without examination. The aviation industry knew twin-engine fighters could not work because torque made them uncontrollable. This knowledge was based on experience and accumulated wisdom. It was also wrong, or more precisely, incomplete. The torque problem was real. Conventional solutions had proven inadequate. But the assumption these were the only possible solutions was false. Counter-rotating propellers were always physically possible. Nobody tried them because the solution seemed too simple, too obvious, therefore unlikely to work if nobody else had thought of it. This pattern appears repeatedly in innovation history. Experts become invested in complexity, assuming difficult problems require complicated solutions. Simple approaches are dismissed not because proven wrong, but because they seem naive. Breakthroughs come when someone, often outside established expert communities, asks basic questions and pursues simple answers even when experts insist they cannot work. Kelly Johnson was 27 when he proposed counter-rotating propellers. He had been out of university for 4 years. He had not accumulated decades of experience teaching him what was impossible. His youth and relative inexperience were actually advantages. He had not learned to dismiss simple solutions. He was willing to challenge assumptions older, more experienced engineers accepted without question. The P-38's success demonstrated simplicity is not simplistic. Counter-rotating propellers were simple in concept, but the simplicity came from understanding fundamental physics rather than superficial thinking. Johnson had done calculations. He understood exactly why torque occurred and how opposite rotation would cancel it. His solution was simple because he identified root causes rather than treating symptoms. Modern engineering education emphasizes this lesson, teaching students to seek simple solutions to complex problems by understanding fundamentals. The P-38 story is frequently cited as elegant engineering example, where difficult problems were solved through insight rather than brute force. Kelly Johnson is held up as the engineer who questions rather than accepts, who seeks simplicity rather than complexity, who trusts physics rather than conventional wisdom. Counter-rotating propellers have appeared on numerous designs since, from small general aviation twins to large military transports. The concept has been adapted for helicopter rotors, marine propulsion, and various applications. The simple idea Johnson proposed in 1938 propagated throughout multiple engineering disciplines because it solves fundamental problems elegantly. The P-38 Lightning flew its last combat missions in 1945, but the aircraft's legacy extends far beyond wartime service. It demonstrated twin-engine fighters could work. It proved counter-rotating propellers were practical. Most importantly, it showed breakthrough. Innovations can come from questioning assumptions and pursuing simple solutions, even when conventional wisdom insists they cannot work. The young civilian engineer who suggested making propellers spin backward changed air combat forever. His simple question, dismissed by many as naive or impractical, became foundation for one of World War II's most successful aircraft. The miracle of the P-38 was not complicated technology or massive resources. It was willingness to question what everyone knew to be true, and courage to pursue an answer that seemed too simple to possibly be right. Sometimes the most profound innovations are the simplest. Sometimes the crazy fix is the one that works. And sometimes all it takes to change history is asking a question nobody else thought to ask. What if they spun backward?